Next we have the Gospel of Matthew. And like John, Matthew was an actual eyewitness of much of Jesus' life, being one of the 12 apostles. He formerly was a Jewish tax collector for the Roman government, and he's also known as Levi in the Bible. That was his Jewish name. And Matthew is the most exhaustive of all the Gospels. It covers the broadest collection of events. I would say Matthew is the third most chronological of the 4 Gospels. It doesn't deviate as much as Luke. Matthew stays relatively close to the order of events found in Mark, but skips around here and there to bring out certain distinctions he deems necessary. Matthew is interested in bringing out detail in teaching narratives. So if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, for example, covered in great detail, mentioned briefly in Luke and not in the others. Jesus' end-time predictions in Matthew 24 and 25. You have 3 stories in Matthew 25 that aren't covered anywhere else. And in Matthew 24, you have accounts in Mark 13 and Luke 21, but Matthew is by far using the most detail. Then there's Matthew 10, verses 1 to 23, which is the passage about Jesus sending out the 12 apostles as missionaries. Matthew contains extra detail as Jesus starts predicting what will happen to them. So Matthew loves describing when Jesus is expounding on truth and predicting future events. However, when it's a recollection of action events, Matthew is the least detailed. It's the complete opposite. He actually skims over them briefly. So we have an interesting example of the feeding of the 5,000, and then Jesus gets the disciples to go into the boat and cross to the other side while he goes up on the mountain and prays. Then Jesus has to walk on the water to save the disciples, whose boat is almost going to capsize in the storm. So we see here that Matthew does, in this one instance, include an extra detail that other Gospels don't include, which is Peter walking on the water out to Jesus. Now, we know that John and Matthew, both of them would have been in the boat, because they were the 12 apostles. For some reason, I don't know why John doesn't include this, but Matthew does. And that's the one time where he gives more detail. But for the rest of the story, for the whole feeding of the 5,000 narrative and the story of Jesus walking out onto the water, that whole narrative is quick fire. He gets through it with far less detail. But here's an interesting fact with respect to Matthew and specifics. It's to do with what I call doubles. So what I mean by that is where there are 2 characters other than Jesus involved in a story, Matthew always emphasises this. Mark and Luke generally focus on the primary character in the story, whereas Matthew will always include them both. So this happens multiple times. For example, Matthew shows us that there were actually 2 demoniacs in the Gadarenes. Mark and Luke only focus on the main guy with the legion of demons. There were actually 2 blind men healed in the blind Bartimaeus story, but Mark only focuses on Bartimaeus. Then we have the donkey with her colts tied alongside her for Jesus' triumphal entry. Because Jesus only rode on the colt, both Mark and Luke fail to mention the mother donkey.